All right, we are live. Thanks for tuning in. Short notice, but I really got away from the regular and consistent live program schedule. It was Thursday, then it became Friday. I was even doing it on Saturday a little bit, so it's just kind of going to be one of these things where we just kind of, I go when I can. And I did want to get the debate on my channel, which I did yesterday before we did kind of a review. So that's what we're going to do, is a review of the debate that I had. Now, if you haven't seen it, that's okay, because you can go and you can go check it out. It's on 2 YouTube channels out there. David Lewis in the audience. Apologetics from the Attic. That's David Lewis. Me and David also had a debate. That debate's on there too. How you doing, David? It's good to see you in the audience. Hope all is well with you. But yeah, so I did the debate, and I'll talk a little bit about it and have some comments about the content and about the debate itself. And I always got a critique of my own performance, of course. But that's kind of how it goes. But it's out there. And so if you haven't seen it, well, nothing, I mean, obviously the thing with the debate is you don't spoil it by talking about it before you see it. So that's all right. You can watch it after the fact. But, I'm kind of letting the time pass a little bit so some people can roll in. But it was over Calvinism. I appreciate that, Clint. Now, yeah, and by the way, any audio feedback will always be appreciated, because I haven't done it in a while, but it should hook right up. I do have the phone up, which I didn't do for a long time, but it is there if you want to call in and get comments on the debate, or questions, or criticisms, or if you disagree. You could always call in. And I don't put the phone number up there much because people don't call in, but I know that at times like this, you will have a tendency for more people to call, if you do. But the side chat is always there, right? But, all right, so I'll tell you what I'm going to do using the debate. Now, I haven't talked about Calvinistic issues in a while. I think I talked a little bit about some things, maybe with Corey Smart. Is that his name? Corey, maybe Smart. See, I always forget these things. I'm terrible with names. But the Smart Christian Channel guy, we talked a little bit about that. But, we haven't talked about it in a long time. Now, for a long time, we talked a lot about Calvinistic issues. And then, for the past year, we've done the mid-Acts dispensational thing. We've done a lot of that. But using the debate, we kind of going to get back into it. And I'll tell you that I was hoping to get a debate with James White. That has not happened, but it's still possible. That's really all I could say, because that's really all it is, and it may not even happen. But so if at least my name will be thrown out there to James if the current person he's debating doesn't work out. And even then, he may not choose to debate me, even if his name or my name gets thrown out, because he doesn't know who I am. Well, he kind of does, because I met him. I met him last year at the very place that I debated Jeremiah there last Saturday. But that'd be great if that turned out and I got to debate someone. I respect James White a lot, disagree with him a lot on soteriology. I think he's very wrong. Of course, that's the way it is. I mean, it's kind of the way with Jeremiah. And but, when there's some respect there between two people, you can have a good dialogue and a good debate. It's like David Lewis here. Now, David's in the audience. Him and I had a debate. I didn't know him a whole lot. I did hear him on a couple of things. He has that golden radio voice. But so we debated, and he's an incredibly nice guy. And so I think that debate flowed very well because of that dynamic. And I tried to bring that with Jeremiah, and I think I could bring that with James White. But again, there's no... that's just if the person he's debating doesn't work out. And then even then, he may not choose to go with me. But that'd be great if it did, right? Okay, so let's talk about the debate, though. Well, Chris Scaff, I appreciate the comment. Apologetics from the Attic. David says, I enjoyed the mid-Acts dispensational content. Helped me understand it before I met some people who are coming out of that false teaching. Yeah, it's it's not a good teaching at all. It is a teaching that says you don't have to obey Jesus from the gospel accounts, only from what Paul says about Jesus, and many other things, multiple gospels, that kind of things. But okay, so we did this debate. Now Jeremiah from Apologetics Dog. First of all, I like Jeremiah. There's some respect. And I think that's why the debate was interesting and entertaining, because there wasn't hostility there to cloud the interest. There was jokes back and forth here and there, hopefully not too much to take away from the seriousness of the issue, and that can become a problem. But so I got to say, first of all, that I do appreciate Jeremiah, and we've kind of said this so many times now to each other, but as much as we disagree, and as important as the issues is, because this is a matter of God's truth, it was never personal animosity. Okay, but all that's been said, and I don't want to say that too much, because Jeremiah knows it, I know it, and we can just get into the issues. And now, but what I do plan to do is a Calvinism series, where I'm going to use a lot of content from Jeremiah in the debate and from other Calvinists, a lot of the prominent ones, White, MacArthur, Piper, those kinds of things, and make a series out of it. Now, this is a debate review. I'm going to talk general things. I'm going to bring up some stuff, and I'm going to play some of the debate, of course, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so now I will say this. Obviously, the most important thing about these debates is the content, the message, is the truth being explained. Is the truth being given by somebody? Of course, you could have debates where neither one of them are correct. But that being the most important thing, by far, of course. But there's other aspects to debates that's, I think, important too. I would say one thing: no matter which side you are on, this debate is interesting, and it will keep your interest. You won't watch this debate and say, boy, that was boring, because that does happen. There are debaters who kind of have a boring persona, and I suppose it could always be the case that some people think I have a boring persona too. But I think generally, whatever you think of my beliefs or Jeremiah's, you're going to say, this debate will keep you your interest. You see, that is good about a debate. Because since the message is important and the content in the debate, having your interest in the debate because of how it's presented is good too. It keeps you listening, if nothing else. Because I've listened to debates that the subject is very interesting to me. I find very important, but I don't finish the debate, because it's kind of boring. The guys are kind of boring speakers. So that's helpful. Now there's a line, not to be too jokey, and or humorous, and I'll tell you why some of that is good for debate. The same reason some humor is good when you're working, on a job or something, because it helps keep the tension down. The more tension from the debaters, the more tension the audience feels, and it can cause some people to stop listening, this kind of thing. So those things are good, to have something to break the tension. Now, as I said, though, the most important thing is the message, of course. Because you are dealing with what the Bible is saying about something. And so we're going to cover some of that. Now, the debate is about free will. And so I'll explain a couple things here before we get into this. And I appreciate everybody's feedback. There's been a lot of feedback about the debate. And I really appreciate that. And I do appreciate all the people that came. People traveled. Tax Savage, who's often in the side chat, he was there, and some others that I know. And one gentleman that I've been getting to know through the internet primarily, Matthew Hatchett, he traveled. He's sometimes in the side chat, and he traveled a good distance. So that is really appreciated. But the interest, But so we did the debate, and I have a couple of spots that we're just going to go to and listen to. But explain a couple things here. And remember, in the Calvinism series that, Lord willing, I plan to do, we'll hit these, and you won't have all the long introduction, this kind of thing here. But I'll say this. So compatibilism, so that everybody knows. What does compatibilism mean? Well, among Calvinists, within Calvinism is a subgroup known as compatibilists. And I suppose that there could be many Calvinists who call themselves compatibilists, but aren't really making the arguments that compatibilists make, like Jeremiah. So compatibilist, the word compatible means to work together, to get along. In other words, it's non-contradictory. They're harmonious. Two things being, or multiple things being harmonious. So the reason for the label of compatibilism is because it is a label for these certain Calvinists who are saying, we believe and make the case that God's determinism of all things, that He determines all things, is compatible, is not contradictory to the idea of man being free or responsible. Because that's the idea, right? Because the first time somebody hears Calvinism and its major tenets there, will say, well, wait a minute, if God determines everything you do unconditionally, unchangeably, or He saves some people just unconditionally and just chooses it and chooses for some to be lost, how can He hold men accountable? How can man be free and are responsible if that's the case? And so the Calvinist that labels himself a compatibilist says, well, I believe those two things are not contradictory. But the rest of us are sitting back going, how is that? They do seem to be contradictory. How could you call man's choices free, or say that he has a free will, or say that he's responsible for his choices, if God has determined all his choices and actions? So that's really the issue, right? And that's what the debate is about. So compatibilists are those within Calvinism that say, I have an answer for that. I have an explanation. I believe that the two are not contradictory. I believe that the two are compatible. Thus, they are compatibilist. By the way, you have compatibilists in the atheistic worldview, so don't be confused by the two. I would say, maybe I didn't word that right. The issue exists among atheism, too, or a naturalistic worldview, because a lot of atheists do believe in natural determinism. But anyway, without taking time to go there. Okay, so David, Apologetics from the Attic says he's a compatibilist. That's right. So many of them are. James White, one of the best defenders of Calvinism, at least in my view, is a compatibilist. Shannon Herring, he was there. I was glad to see him there. Really, and by the way, anybody that enjoys the debate, Shannon Herring, you can thank him. I mean, obviously, Jeremiah agreed to participate, but, it was Shannon Herring motivating and asking me regularly, hey, get a hold of Jeremiah and get this debate, so you guys can thank him that it really moved along in the first place. Well, and while I'm at it, I'll just go ahead and say once again that I do also want to thank Jeremiah, but also I got to say this because I didn't say it at the beginning, I meant to. The debate presentation, video-wise, I just thought was fantastic. It's one of the best that I've seen. They did a great job of audio and the visual transitions, and you had, the moderator Nathan pop up on the screen like he did, and I just thought it was all great, and I really find a lot of those things important. I'm kind of a video director at heart, but I just thought they did a fantastic job, better than many others that I've seen. So I really wanted to mention that. So Shannon Herring says compatibilism is a form of determinism, right or wrong. It is a form. I mean, they are determinists. They believe in determinism. But so you remember if you ever watched the discussion between James White and William Lane Craig, you see that discussion on Unbelievable where William Lane Craig says, well, James, that's because you're a determinist. And James White said, yep. So yeah, they're determinists. They believe in determinism. And so yes, compatible is a form of it. Well, okay, so I would like for David, so David says no, determinism is a form of incompatibilism. I'd like for you to kind of spell that out. So what do you mean, and what am I mistaken on? So when I say that compatibilism is a form of determinism, I'm talking about in theological camps. So help me out here, because I want to know what you mean. So what I mean when I say yes, it is, I mean compatibilists believe in determinism. In other words, they hold to the view that God determines all things, and Jeremiah agreed to that in the debate, but that determinism is compatible with man's free will. So explain to me what I'm missing there. And a serious question. I mean, maybe I'm missing what you mean. Now, David does say compatibilism does include the idea of determinism. Okay, so David says a determinist holds that free will is incompatible. It means it will not work together with the ideas of God determining all things, and also libertarians are also incompatibilist. Well, but you would say that it is true that, I mean, you may not, so do you call yourself a determinist? It's because James White says he's a determinist and he is a compatibilist. So I don't know what I'm missing, and maybe I want to know if I'm actually missing or misusing something here or some theological label, because, I mean, how would you analyze my statement that Calvinists who believe in determinism, but that free will is compatible with man's free will, would also be called compatibilists? So I'm missing something there. Okay, so David might call in. All right, that's good. Now, here's the thing. I haven't used my phone system here in a long time. So, David, when you call, and if it doesn't work, you can just try again. And if the audio, we'll see how it goes. Sometimes it's a little iffy if I haven't used it. And I don't use it often, but that's good. You can call in. Well, but so like what I said, James White is a determinist. He accepts that he's a determinist. He said it right there in the debate. But he's a compatibilist, meaning that he believes that the two things are compatible. So, well, if David successfully calls in, we'll see what's happening there. Not a big deal one way or the other there. Now, so let me go back to what I was saying. So at any rate, the original things I was saying are true. So that's what a compatibilist. He's someone who says the two things are compatible, which is something I disagree with, and I think most people do. Now, one thing that Jeremiah kept saying in the debate is, well, he's assuming incompatibilism. Well, the problem is, you have to remember also that it's not just me. It's plenty of Calvinists also tell you that they cannot rationalize the two things. So this is what I think. Jeremiah presented the whole debate as if, no, this is just based upon your assumptions. It's easy. All right, let's see how this works. All right, you're on live. Let's see if we can hear you.
Hello?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hello. All right, can you hear me? It looks like you can't hear me. Let's see here.
Hello, AK, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Now, see, I don't think he can hear me. I don't know. See, I don't know why that is. That is odd. See, I should have. If you don't use the system in a while, you should. Let me see. All right. Well, if he calls back, yeah, I said, David, I could hear you. You couldn't hear me. I don't know why that is, though. That is odd. I could try to run it through this thing. There we go. All right. Okay. You know what you could do, David? If you call in again and you still can't hear me, just hold on, and we'll go back to the old-fashioned way. I'll just hold the phone to the microphone. So go ahead. You can. The only problem with that is sometimes in this area, right where I would need it, there's not as much signal. How about that? So anyway, yeah, you go ahead and try to call in again, and we'll see if you can hear me. All right, can you hear me?
Yes, AK, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. All right, it's working. That's good. We'll see how long that works.
You want to give it a second, see if the people in the chat can hear everything?
Yeah, that's good. All right, everybody, let me know. Can you hear David, and can you hear me? We're about 30 seconds behind, so about 30 seconds, we'll see what they're going to say here. Cool. By the way, okay, they're saying yes, they can hear us, so there you go. All right, great. David, I appreciate you calling in.
Yeah, man. No problem.
Yeah, well, okay, so you understood what I was said. So when I said that it's a form of determinism, I meant that compatibilists believe in determinism. Now, do you not believe in determinism, or how would you differ with James White on that?
Yeah. So I mean, I agree with what you're saying. So these are philosophical categories, of course, which part of me. And I notice you in the debate were trying to keep it biblical, 1 Corinthians says what it says, and Jeremiah kept saying, well, you're assuming incompatibilism, et cetera, et cetera. But these are philosophical categories, right? So a compatibilist, by definition, and you said it correctly, says that it's compatible. The idea is that God determines everything that happens in time, yet human beings have genuine freedom and responsibility in the choices they make.
Yeah.
So compatibilism includes both the idea of determinism and free will, right? Now, incompatibilism, philosophically, a determinist is an incompatibilist, a hard determinist. Because they would reject the idea that human freedom exists if you assert that God determines all things, right? Also, a libertarian philosophically is also an incompatibilist, because they would say the opposite, right? A libertarian would say it's incompatible for free will to exist in a system where God determines all things. Does that help?
I think it does. Yeah. So in other words, what you're saying is, in purely philosophical categories, those who are determinists would not believe and accept free will and say, yeah, we're still free, like a naturalistic determinist. But
correct. So technically they would be labeled an incompatibilist philosophically.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Now I agree with that. I see. Yeah. Now, but would you agree that theologically, that's why I said theological camps, that you would have determinists only in the sense that, like a Calvinist who believe God decrees all things, but they would still say, no, it's still compatible. In other words, they accept free will.
So if you pinned me to the wall and said, Dave, are you a determinist? I would say yes, in the compatibilistic sense. I'm not a hard determinist, I'm a compatibilist, and those are different. Now, I hear what you're saying, AK. If you're trying to come from a biblical perspective, the point is, where's that in the Bible? Where does the Bible make those distinctions, biblically? And it really doesn't. That's a philosophical thing being used to interpret the Bible, which I think we all do to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Right? The Bible, the way the Bible's revealed, it's in narrative, and there's a sense in which we all bring our presuppositions. You can call it philosophy, or you could just call it just presuppositions, right, to interpreting the text.
Yeah. Well, and what I was saying about it is compatibilism is a form of determinism, and I said, well, theologically, I just simply mean as far as theological groups, that seems to be what it would be. Now, might not be purely philosophical outside of theological groups, but that's what I was saying. Theologically, those that hold to determinism, such as the Reformed, like yourself or James White, would still be compatibilist, although not all Calvinists would be compatibilists, I suppose. But But
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and so I am a determinist in the sense of I'm a compatibilist. So I would say that the Bible teaches that God, all things happen according to the counsel of His will, Ephesians 1:11. But also the Bible is very clear that men are held responsible for the decisions they make by God.
Yeah,
which assumes that they have a responsibility.
Okay, so let me ask you this.
Really, what you guys were debating.
Yeah, it was. Now, let me ask you this, and I don't know how long you want to stay on the phone. Just let me know. But and because the reason I want to ask you this is because I figured someone like you is going to give me an honest, unbiased answer. But now I know you agree with Jeremiah's side, and that's fine. That's not really important to the question. But I just want to know, when you were listening, when Jeremiah is trying to explain how it's compatible, and he's using all these terms, conditional ability and all this. Now, I would give you my view, but the reason I'm asking you is because, of course, I'm going to be biased, right? Because I'm the one debating. And a lot of people that I talked to said, I didn't understand a word he said. Now, it is always the case that there's going to be some things some people don't understand, but I try to keep it as simple as I could. But in my estimation, even most Calvinists would not follow Jeremiah. Now, this doesn't make him wrong, but I think as far as presenting your information, I just think it went over almost everybody's head unless they were already extremely studied and already taken a position. So from your perspective now, maybe you're familiar with the terms and languages or language that are used. So would you say that he made it real simple and understandable, or you think he talked over everybody's head?
No, there's a sense in which this topic can become philosophical and difficult to understand. So I understood what he was saying, not totally. There were some parts where I had to think about what he was saying and try to follow what he was saying. But how can I say this? Certain people's mind is wired a certain way, and they can think through philosophical categories, which I think Jeremiah would admit those categories of categorical ability, are philosophical categories being brought in to try to explain. But AK, one thing I would say about it is it's similar to the doctrine of the Trinity. Because to understand the biblical doctrine of the Trinity, you do have to understand some categories like being and person, for example. Yeah. And what the Nicene Creed means when it says Jesus is homoousios, of one being with the Father. So, I mean, that's a good analogy. Or that, when we're talking about certain biblical doctrines, you do have to think a little bit harder than other ones.
No, I agree. Well, I do agree with you, and I'm not saying one can't use philosophical terms. Even libertarian free will is philosophical.
Sure.
But it's kind of like I presented my view, and I think the average person can understand the vast majority of what I'm saying. I mean, and I appreciate your take. Now, you said you understood them. Okay, that's fine. I don't think most people would, and I don't even think most Calvinists followed what he was saying. Now, I'm not saying I didn't understand what he's saying. I'm saying he didn't bring it down very far to the average level. And some of the things I said, I mean, even the word immutability, I mean, some people said, well, what does that mean? But I think it's very important in debate that you kind of use bring it down. I mean, but listen, I've told people before, you listen to William Lane Craig, he's great, but you're going to have to study some words because he doesn't speak to the average person. But so that's the difference.
I've heard James White say this many times in his debates. He'll say that this debate, for many of you, this will be your first exposure to an issue that you need to start studying for yourself. Don't just let the debate be the end-all, be-all of your own study of the issue.
Yeah, that is important, and I have tried to tell audiences that before. It really is. A debate is just it's either the beginning or just a means to keep on studying. But that was my view anyway. I mean, I understand the things he was saying. Some of the terms he used, of course, are new, but I think it was overly complicated. Of course, that's my view. I'm the guy who's debating, so I'd be biased, I guess they would say, but that's okay. That's just my view. No, I appreciate your take, though. And I appreciate you calling in about the. By the way, I just
want to make. Yeah, I do have to run, but I just want to make one more point. And just to find some common ground. I mean, would you agree that there is some mystery surrounding the issue of God's, let's call it his sovereignty and human free will? Like, there is a sense in which both of our sides are going to reach a point where we have to admit there is a mystery to the sovereign God and how he runs his universe, right? And how that relates to human choices. Would you at least admit that much?
There is definitely mystery in some of those aspects. One thing I've said before, when you start a lot about what God foreknows and how it relates to the present, it can be difficult to grasp. And other thing, I talked about God changing his mind. That's somewhat of a difficult concept to think through. But
yeah.
So I'll agree with you that I don't claim to have all the answers on all the aspects of what we're talking about. I've just made my position clear that I think to me, Calvinism just leaves blatant irrationality. You obviously, that you disagree, and that's fine. But then I made my case in the debate. I don't think those things so this is what I'm saying, David. I don't think you need the mystery with compatibilism in the issue, because I don't think it's needed if you don't have determinism. Now, of course, someone like yourself, you say you believe it's in the Bible. Okay, I understand. But for me, I just leave determinism out, and I don't have a problem in those cases at all. Now, I might have some difficult areas in other cases, but for me, there's no difficulty at all with the things Calvinists struggle with, which is harmonizing man's responsibility and determinism. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there are difficult things.
But I would say that I have the difficulty because the Bible presents me with the difficulty. Like Acts 4:27 and 28 is one of the classic texts where you have the crucifixion of the Messiah is predestined and ordained by the hand and plan of God. So you have God predestining murder to accomplish his purposes, and yet you have sinners who freely made those choices and are going to be held accountable for them. Like, that's a text right there. It has nothing to do with what I'm reading into the text, I don't believe. I just look at a text like that and I say, wow, both of those elements are present in that text.
Well, I think you are reading
Pilate,
something.
The people of Israel, crucifying the Messiah, yet God's hand and plan predestined for it to take place.
That's right. Well, I do think you're reading something into it, though. I think you're assuming that he determined their motives and intentions. Can God prophesy, plan out, and work through people that have free choices and accomplish his will?
Well, that's not what predestination means, though.
Well, predestination means he destines. Well, the word predestination, especially as it relates to atonement, means the atonement itself it was something that he planned before it occurs. But even if you don't want to use the word predestination, but what I'm saying is, does God have to determine man's will in order to accomplish his own?
No, he doesn't have. No, of course he doesn't have to do anything. But he. Okay. But I think the other systems like Molinism or simple foreknowledge or open theism, you could say we don't take seriously the human freedom element, and Pilate had his own motives and God worked with them. But we're just saying those other systems don't seem to take seriously the fact that it says in that text, it uses 3 words actually: God's plan, his hand, which the Holy Spirit didn't have to put that word in there. So it's implying that God's a little more personally involved in that than just he foresaw that they would do something and he used it to accomplish his plan. No, his hand is involved, predestined what would take place.
Yeah. Well, of course, I don't believe it's just him foreseeing it and then using it. I believe he works within it. I'll give you an example. So this was the way and the time in which Christ was crucified in fulfilling God's purpose in the atonement and bringing redemption. But there were other times when people wanted to kill Jesus, but God did not allow it to happen. And however he did that, it doesn't say. I mean, I don't know, but he did it. He knows how to do it. But he let it occur, and he let things come together when he wanted it and how he wanted it, using what I would say people with the intentions and motives that originate in their heart and not God's, and he uses them. So, yeah, I get what you're saying, and that's not my view. I don't believe he just foresees and say, hey, look what they're doing, I'll just use it. No, I think he uses men and their motives and knows how to arrange them and set them up, is a word I like to often use. He will set them up in his own time and place to use their evil, not only against them, but for his own purpose, So, but...
I agree. I mean, what's helped me a lot is you add to that the doctrine of God's, you could call it providence, but like his upholding of all things. So like even while those men are having their motives, right? God is in charge of every heartbeat they have, every breath they take, letting their brain function. So would you at least agree that God's a little more intimately involved than just a spectator, right?
Oh, sure.
He had
Absolutely.
to make sure Pilate was born when he was born. The high priest, right? The leader of the Pharisees, all these different people, like the millions upon billions of things that had to coincide perfectly to bring about that result, AK, is not just God foreseeing it, right? There's an orchestration going on at the very least.
Oh, I love the word orchestration. And yes, God is very intimately. I mean, it's not, as I said, he's not just looking and using. He's not just saying, hey, they're going to do this. Joseph's brothers are going to turn him in, turn him over. I'll use that. No, they wanted to kill him even before that. But he knows how to restrain their actions when he wants it, get them into a situation where they will use their own motives in a way that's going to be beneficial to him. I mean, he knows how to orchestrate evil men. See, this is my point, David, and you're hitting it right on the spot. God knows how to orchestrate men to do what he wants, when he wants, without determining their wills, and he could use their evil and their evil motives that originated in their hearts against them and for his purposes, and he doesn't have to determine their motive. But I like what you said just early on when you started making this point, and I think it's really great because you said, well, for me, because I talked about the difficulty you guys have with if you just drop determinism, you wouldn't have, but you said, well, but I can't just drop it because it's what the Bible presents. See, that's what I appreciate. See, when I question Calvinists so often on things, I understand they want to attempt to rationalize, and perhaps you, David, think it can be rationalized. Okay, fine. But if they say, well, it doesn't matter if you rationalize it, here's the Bible presenting it, then I think, okay, fine, that's a great answer, because it's two things to say, well, it has to be rationalized or it can be rationalized, or say, well, AK, what if I can't rationalize it? It's what the Bible says. Well, then we got a different discussion, and we can say that's a great thing to talk about. So ultimately, if a Calvinist,
great, no, that's great.
I mean,
I think that
go ahead.
And I'm not the type of Calvinist. There's many Calvinists out there who want to make this issue of God's sovereignty, his providence, determinism, whatever you want to say, such a central issue to their theology, to the point where they won't even have fellowship with other Christians who don't believe this way they do about this topic. And I'm not like that.
Are you talking about a hyper-Calvinist?
Yeah, well, not even hyper-Calvinists. It's like we call them cage stage Calvinists sometimes. They're overzealous, and they read A.W. Pink's book called The Sovereignty of God, and that's like the blue pill into Calvinism. If people read it and they get all fired up, because I really want to make this point. I put this issue of free will versus God's sovereignty in the same category as I do the Trinity, the deity of Christ. Like, it's an issue that you're never going to resolve, and I like the word you use, rationally. You're not going to. I think that it's one of those things where the Bible presents that God is one, yet that one being of God is shared by three persons. That Jesus is fully, truly God and truly man in one hypostatic union. I can't explain that rationally. I don't know if you can. I can't. I can attempt to study the Bible and bow the knee to what truth it reveals, but I can't ultimately explain it. I just say I put that in the same category as sovereignty of God, free will.
Well, I know what you're saying. I would disagree with being in the same category. I do believe the Trinity can be difficult, and I don't expect people to be able to articulate it so greatly. I do believe there's a difference in comprehension and something being irrational. I don't believe it is irrational to say God is in one sense three and in one sense one. There's nothing irrational about that. There is difficulty. Understanding God's eternality is difficult, but it's not irrational. You know, the fact that God self-exists is difficult, but it's not irrational. I do believe there is a lot of irrationality in Calvinism, and if you didn't have determinism, it wouldn't be there. But as you said, it becomes a second discussion and a more important one. But it's what the Bible presents. And by the way, that's why you and I had such a great debate, because we focused on passages, not big concepts. And I think it was a great debate for that reason.
Yeah, and you know where I got that debate format from, AK? I got that from James White.
Yeah, well, I was aware of that. I love James White's formats. I like the way he does debates, and
he hasn't. Well, that format we did, he hasn't done very often. He did it with Michael Brown one time years ago on his dividing line, and I forget what they were debating, but it was because that debate method, you're focusing on actual scripture passages, right? It focuses the debate on the Bible. That's why I agree. I think that was a really good debate.
Me and Jeremiah we talked about doing one like that, and I think the next time I do something like that, it'll be, well, on Calvinism, it'll be that. Now, unless James White ever debates me, I'll do whatever he's going to choose, because, you know, I can't be too picky, but you know how that goes.
Yeah, well, AK, I'm always willing, you know, to do a debate with you on this topic that way, if you ever want to do one. But
all right, well,
if you could get a debate with James White, that would be amazing.
No, yeah, I mean, as I said, it could be the case if one guy drops out, my name will be mentioned, but he may go, who? I don't know him. Let's go to somebody else. You know how that goes. But anyway, hey, I appreciate you calling in.
He likes, the thing about James White is he likes to study his opponent, so he's going to want to know, do you have material out there that he can, look and study and see your positions, which you do. So
yeah, well, I told the guy that I was asking me, I said, well, here, give him, if you end up giving my info to James White, say I'm not a King James onlyist, because I like the Legacy Standard Bible. I believe, of course, in the Trinity, and so I gave him these things that White would relate to. You know what I'm saying?
You're using that Calvinist Bible there, AK.
Well, Jeremiah gave me the ESV in the debate. Now that's
I saw that was funny. Yeah, that was funny.
Yeah. But the Legacy Standard Bible.
I gotta run, man. But
okay.
Thanks for letting me call in, and I always appreciate your programs. I'm always tuning in, and I'm always liking and sharing your stuff. So.
Hey, I appreciate you, David.
All right, have a good one, AK.
You too. Now, what I was saying about the Legacy Standard, he was joking. It is not. I've been studying it for over a year. It's by no means a Calvinist Bible, and he was joking. But a lot of people do think the ESV is somewhat, it's got some Calvinist persuasion in it. But nevertheless, all right, so let's get to the debate, what we were talking about. Now, ultimately, I'm trying to make this point, and I think compatibilists have this difficult problem, because even many Calvinists, such as John Piper and John MacArthur, they don't do what Jeremiah or James White does. And what do I mean? They're not trying to rationalize it. They don't know how to. And evidently, they don't see that it's too much of a benefit to argue the way White or Matt Slick or Jeremiah does when they're trying to argue and to rationalize two things. In other words, they evidently just say, no, it can't be done, or I can't do it. That's what they say. John Piper says it's just a mystery. So he doesn't try to show that it is rational. So you got one group like, David here would be included, or Jeremiah Nortier, and they would say, no, it is rational. You can rationalize it. It does work together. Now, of course, David admitted that there's some difficulty there. But especially as Jeremiah talks, it's like as easy as 1, 2, 3. I mean, that's really the impression I got from our friend Jeremiah. It's just like, what? Oh, no, this is easy. Just think about these things. And no, and I didn't find, I mean, this is the honest truth, I don't find that he rationalized it. And I think the cross-examination where I asked him and was questioning him about, I was questioning him about abilities in 1 Corinthians 10:13. I think the problem with his responses came out. We might get there here. But we have other people in the side chat, Clint Little, Hunter Tyler, and Joey's there. Appreciate you guys. Tax Savage. No one can explain providence. Now, Hunter Tyler says, Calvinism is God not willing that any shall perish, while willing that certain men must perish. Very irrational. Jeremiah was arguing distinction without a differing result. Chris Scaff says, Joey Chapa says, somewhat. It's a Calvinist Bible for sure. The ESV, I assume he's talking about. Yeah, that's the thing. But not the, see, I just want to be clear, the LSB, and I've been telling people this for a long time, because they say, MacArthur's University put that out. But it is not Calvinistic. I haven't found a shred of Calvinist tendency. But anyway, let's get back to this. Okay, but the problem is, well, first of all, let's Jeremiah, and this is the first place I want to go. And hopefully the audio works here, so let me know that everything's going to work. I'm just going to his first speech, and he's going to kind of give an explanation of what he means by conditional ability. Because this is the ongoing thing in the cross-examination, him saying, well, with conditional ability, it's different than categorical ability. And I was questioning him, and 1 Corinthians 10:13 says a man, if he sins, didn't have to. He could have taken the way out. But if determinism was true, and this is my argument, if he sins, it was because he was unchangeably determined to, and he couldn't take the way out. So the text doesn't mean anything. And this is where he was saying, well, but conditional ability, yes, and categorical ability, no, which ultimately, and this is what I kept trying to get to, I kept trying to keep it in the ultimate issue. But if everything is unchangeable, then it can't be. You don't have any ability. But let's listen to him explain some of this here.
How professionally is. I just want to thank you for choosing to be here. It's irresistible. And it was predestined before the foundation of the world. So let's get into it. I want to begin by affirming that free will is biblical. I want to partially quote one of the last verses that you heard, AK. Proverbs 16:9. Just the first part. We'll get into the rest. The heart of a man plans his way. That's free will. Biblical free will affirms that man makes genuine choices according to his heart's desire. That means he...
And this is what I was bringing down in the cross-examination. Now, what's the first problem there? Now, I want, some of you are interested in, when you're responding to our Calvinist friends, when a statement like that is made, a man genuinely chooses according to his heart's desire. Let's listen to a little bit about that again.
Will is biblical. I want to partially quote one of the last verses that you heard, AK. Proverbs 16:9. Just the first part. We'll get into the rest. The heart of a man plans his way. That's free will. Biblical free will affirms that man makes genuine choices according to his heart's desire.
Man makes genuine choices according to his heart's desire. What's the first question to ask in order to get to the issue? Because that sounds like my view. In my view, man makes genuine choices according to his heart's desire. But he's explaining it as his view. What is the very first question to ask to get it to the issue? See, when you're saying those things, you're not getting anywhere, of course, because he's saying essentially the same thing I say. But to get the discussion straight to the heart of the matter, what do you ask? Exactly, Shannon Herring. who controls a man's desire. When Jeremiah says a man makes genuine choices according to his heart's desires, who determines his heart's desire? And if God is unchangeably determining man's heart's desire, then what does it mean to say he's genuinely making a free choice? If he doesn't control his desire, and his desire, according to Jeremiah, necessitates his choice, then it's just the same as to say it's God is determining the choice. But to call it a genuine choice, and what does that mean? You see, because the genuine choice of Calvinism has to be different than mine. See, remember, I also say, it is also a claim of my view that man makes a genuine choice. So, if Jeremiah says the same thing, then where's the difference? What's the problem? Why do we disagree? Because what genuine means, in his view, is nothing. What does it mean to make a genuine choice? And I'll ask this: if the choice of Calvinism is genuine and compatibilism, if you can qualify that as genuine, how would you qualify the choice in my view, where the man is not being caused to make choices at all? Because typically people call that genuine, where he's actually making a choice that is not necessary, but that simply he's choosing. But if a choice made in a view where God has necessitated it by his unconditional means that he's determined throughout history, and choosing your heart's desire that you had no control over, then what does it mean to be genuine? This is the difficulty. This is the difficulty that everybody except for Calvinists such as Jeremiah have. Not even MacArthur and Piper can rationalize it, and they'll tell you as much. But so it is when he says, and some people were saying it's a distinction without a difference. It really is. They say, well, it's genuine. No, but it isn't genuine according to anything really meaningful. But here's the problem. To say, and let's keep it simple. And this is why in the cross-examination I let him use, all of this stuff that I thought nobody would follow. And I just try to keep my questions right to the point. And I would, I'll press him. And again, not out of hostility, but I would press him. And I would say, conditional ability, that's fine. He'd say, well, it matters. Okay, if it matters, fine. Just say yes then. Yes, there is an ability. That's me always trying to bring it right back down to simplicity. Because logic is still simple at its core. I don't need to be a physicist or an astrophysicist or quantum physicist to show that the things they say about theology and philosophically are incorrect, because logic is simple for the common man. And you could say all day long that there are different kinds of abilities. You get conditional ability, category ability, and you can say, well, how does 1 Corinthians 10:13 work? Which the whole point of the text is to say, if you sin, you didn't have to, there was a way out. But if everything is unchangeably determined, there isn't. That you don't need to do a lot of studying to figure that out. Oh, and by the way, that brings me to another thing that I was going to say. Our Universalist friends, a lot of the Universalists that I interact with, Drew Costin, I just saw his name, so I'm reminded, they have the same premises as Calvinists. They believe the same things, except they have no problem. Now, Drew here will have no problem saying there is no free will, and yes, God is responsible for evil. Using the same premises as our Calvinist friends as far as God determining everything, and everything is unchangeable. So you have, Jeremiah explains it in the debate as if it's just so simple. You can't rationalize this. It's not a problem for Calvinist or for compatibilist. But it's a big problem for a lot of Calvinists who say, I don't know how to do it. And then you got other people like Universalists, or certain Universalists, and there's a number of them, who also believe that God determines everything, but they don't try to say you rationalize. They say, no, you don't have free will. And no, God is the author of sin. They got no problem doing it. Now, Joe, Drew question asked, though, would you say you agree with his statement, though? I didn't watch the debate, so I don't know. Well, as far as his statement is, yeah, the statement itself that I just played, absolutely. That's the point I was making, Drew, that he hadn't said anything different than my view. When Jeremiah says, biblical free will is man making genuine choices according to his heart's desire, my whole point was, since we both say that, where's the problem? And the problem is, in his view, it doesn't really mean anything when God is determining your heart's desire. And by the way, everybody needs to be clear that it's not even true that man chooses his heart's desire. Even then, he's not really being free, is what I'm trying to say. Say it in a better way. Because, Calvinists will often say, well, man is free to sin. He's free to choose his sin. Actually, he's not even that free, because a man may sin in different ways. If you're going to kill somebody, you may kill them with a knife, a gun, you may strangle them. In Calvinism, even when you're going to murder, you're not even free to choose how. Even God determines the how, the when, and the where. So you're not even free to choose the kind of sin. There's no freedom there. They say, well, you're free to sin. There's not even freedom there when you can't even pick the way to sin. And, they would say you do pick it. Well, you pick it because he chooses how you're going to pick. So that's his pick. That's where the logic will always go. But, yeah, Drew, you can call in if the phone will work. We'll see how it goes. We got it to work with David. That was great. Yeah, you can call in. But that's the idea. So let's keep playing it.
That means he deliberates, he thinks about what he wants to do, and he is responsible for what he chooses to do.
You are on live.
Hey, Kay, how's it going? Long time.
It's going all right. How you doing?
Not too bad. I wanted to call in quickly because typing on my phone was not super easy on this. I'm just watching you on my phone. But how can it be a genuine choice if it's based on his desire and his desire is determined by God? And I wanted to ask you, would you agree that a choice is simply selecting between two or more options?
A choice? That's one definition, yeah. A choice is selecting, but, well, it is a choice. Remember, my issue is that if man is determined to select, then ultimately it's really just God's selection, and man can't be rationally held responsible for the selection, yeah.
Sure. So let's take a step back, and you said you agree with the statement that it's based on the desire of his heart. So the choice is based on the desire of man's heart, right?
Well, I could say that, but, not really with what he means. Now, what he means, and Calvinists, this is what they mean when they say that. They say the strongest desire in your heart will necessitate what you choose. So if you are an unregenerate sinner, you're always going to choose your sin because it is the strongest. So in other words, your choices there are necessitated by whatever desire is in your heart. Now, I wouldn't say that. Just so I can be clear, I wouldn't say that. I would say, yeah, your choices are affected by your desires, but they're not necessitated by your desire. Your desires don't choose, you choose, if you know what I mean.
But your desires are you, would you say? I mean, it's a part of you, the way your brain is wired at the time that you make the choice?
You can. Yeah, your desires are part of you, but they do not determine your choices. A man can have, in fact, conflicting desires.
Oh, of course. Like, for instance, I have desire to earn money, but I also have desire to sleep in the morning and not go to work, and one of those wins out.
That's right. Exactly. Well, and my point with that, Drew, is it's not simply that desires determine choices, because even in that case, you had a desire and it didn't determine your choice. You had to choose between the two.
Sure, and I agree with that, actually. So the person making the choice, though, the you that is making the choice is basically a collection of neurons and what have you, synapses making the choice, determining what is the better option for you, or the option that you're, I don't know the best way to word that is, I'm not a neuroscientist, but it's basically the wiring in the brain at the time the choice is made would be what determines the choice that you do end up making, or the option that you end up selecting between 2 or 3 options, right?
Well, no, that's kind of a naturalistic understanding, but of course it is your view, right? I mean, I think in the group
I would say that is my view. But even if you take it a step back and say it's based on you as a spirit, if I believed in conscious spirits, it's still based on the quote wiring of the spirit at that time. You can take it as many steps back or as many layers as you want. It's still going to be based on, I'm just using the word wiring, in air quotes here, for lack of a better term. But it's still based on how you are structured at the time the choice is made, right? Whether the you is a brain or a spirit or whatever.
Well, I mean, no doubt what's going on in your physical brain is a part of what's going on. In other words, I would say, for example, that if a man's brain does not sense that there's, a drink behind him, and thus he doesn't know if it's not in his brain, if the information ain't in his physical brain, he's not going to choose to pick it up because he doesn't know it's there. But his physical brain, I do not believe, determines your choice. I believe the chooser chooses his choice. I don't believe your physical brain is
the chooser, though. Like I would argue the physical brain is the chooser. What would you say is the chooser?
The spirit. See, but that's the difference between you and I. Is I believe man is
fair. That's fine.
Yeah, so I believe I believe the spirit. The spirit connects to the physical world through the brain, but it is the spirit that is making choices.
Yeah, and that's fine. So let's say that it's the spirit that's making the choice, using the brain to do that based on what the brain senses. The spirit itself still has its own quote mind, or it itself is structured in a certain way that it makes a choice, whether but let's not even make it a moral choice. Let's just say you're at a restaurant and they tell you we're out of most food, all we have is steak and lobster. Which do you choose?
You said the restaurant only serves steak or lobster?
Yeah, and you have to choose one, or neither.
Yeah, well, your choice can be limited by your options, if that's what you're getting at. Yeah.
Correct. So let's just keep it really simple. There are only technically 2 options. Well, we won't even allow for the option of neither. You have to choose one or the other. Which one do you choose?
Which one do you choose? Well,
I'd choose steak, but what do you choose?
Well, I would always choose a steak if it's available, but 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 here's the thing.
Why did the chooser, your spirit, choose steak over lobster?
Well, but when you ask why, that could either mean your reason or that can mean what caused it. But that's the issue, because reasons don't cause anything. But if you're asking what caused it in the sense of necessitated it, that's an assumption. That's assuming determinism, which I don't think anything causes your choice. You simply choose. But so, for an example like that, you got to choose.
What does it mean to choose? What does it mean to choose? Is the question, I guess. Then.
The
spirit is choosing, not the brain. It's not the wiring of the brain, as you said. You're going a step lower, below that to the spirit. So it's the structure of the spirit at the time the choice is available is making that choice.
Well, I think I think we can keep it pretty simple. A choice in this case is when the mind selects one of the options, and
that's the definition of choice, exactly.
And so,
yep.
But always remember that when you ask why a choice was made in these discussions, anyway, not in casual conversation, but in these discussions, you have to distinguish whether the why means what caused it or whether the why means what reasons. Reasons are not causes, and if the why is meant by the questioner to mean what caused it, then that's assuming determinism, which I don't believe anything causes your choice except for you, the chooser. You are choosing. But anyway, this is getting very philosophical. So
it is, yeah. What I was trying to get at is you can take God out of the equation altogether here, and you still come to the same conclusion. Whatever the reason is, you're still going to have determinism, in my view, even if God doesn't exist.
But you would acknowledge, right, that reasons do not cause a choice.
There's a reason that a certain, I'm trying to think of the right wording here, so I might not even be meaning the same thing as you by reason. So maybe you should define what you mean by a reason.
Well, for example, this is the normal one that's given. A man is hungry, and let's say he's been fasting for a week, and he sees a steak, a ribeye, medium rare, that's how I like it, and so he contemplates if he's going to eat it, and he decides to eat it. Okay, he had a reason. He was hungry, and it tastes good. You can have many reasons there. It tastes good. He's hungry. Those are the reasons. But this is my point, though. He could also choose not to eat it. So the reasons are there no matter what, but but they don't cause the selection because he could choose not to eat, as he's been doing for a week, even though the reasons have been there.
And hopefully he wouldn't, because if he ate a steak after a week of fasting, he'd be very sick.
That's true. That's very true. It wouldn't be a good one. But the point is that reasons are not causes.
Yeah, I agree there. And that might be why it might even be better to take the word choice out of the topic altogether and say selection. What should be select? Because when we say choice, we read a lot into that. We're assuming it means something more than it necessarily does, or less.
Okay, but since you're here, I have made the statement. You could tell me if I'm wrong, at least in regard to you. I've heard other universalists in your camp say it, but you would have no problem, would you, saying that God is the author of sin, having determined everything?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so, and that was the point I was making. So you haven't watched the debate, obviously, so you don't agree then generally with the Calvinists who try to rationalize how man is... I don't know how you do that. So do you just reject free will at all, or do you say, well, no, it's free will in some sense?
I believe free will exists, and I believe free will doesn't exist. This comes down to the definition of free will I'm using at the time I'm saying the sentence free will exists, or the time I'm saying the sentence free will doesn't exist. Everybody means something different by the phrase free will. So it's really tricky. If all you mean is a human can make a choice, then yeah, I believe if that's what you mean by free will, then sure, free will exists.
Well, typically what people mean...
Free will...
Well, okay, so let's say libertarian free will. In other words, the ability to choose without external or prior causal determination.
I don't know what that means.
Okay, in other words, you have the ability to choose without something else necessitating, that is, your choice.
I should clarify. When I say I don't know what that means, I mean logically there's no possibility for that to even exist, like from a scientific or logical perspective or philosophical perspective. So that's why I don't understand what you mean. I don't understand how that can be. Forget theology, forget God, temporarily here, hypothetically. It's still not possible what you're saying in my mind, because everything either has a cause or doesn't have a cause. If something has a cause, it's predetermined. If it doesn't have a cause, it's random. That neither of those are free will.
All right, so
the term.
I think you do presuppose libertarian free will. Let me ask you this. Do you believe there are people who think they're God's people, who think they are and think they understand the Bible, but don't and are not?
If I understood your question correctly, yes.
So you agree there are people who think they actually are God's people when they're actually not at all. Now, you would believe that ultimately they will be, of course, but of course right now not. And they genuinely think they understand the Bible, but you think that they're actually wrong.
Yes.
Okay. So, but they believe they are. So, do you believe God? If you believe God determines all things as you do you believe that God determined for them to think that they're right and think they understand the Bible and interpret it wrong and think that they're right?
Yes, but not necessarily in the way that you might be thinking I'm thinking that. I believe that based on the way humans are now since the fall, we're naturally in a state. It's similar to total depravity, but I don't actually believe in total depravity. It's more along the lines of the verse in Corinthians about how the God of this eon has blinded the apprehensions of the unbelieving. So all humans are naturally in a state of disbelief, and they're incapable of believing in the truth unless God has opened their eyes. So it's similar to Calvinism in that regard, but I don't believe in total depravity because I don't believe it's
not total depravity, but the idea that
I believe it's Satan blinding human minds, basically.
Well, but do you believe that? But do you believe every choice, as Calvinists do, is unchangeably determined from eternity past? And you know what I mean by that. You know, I'm not debating eternity, but before creation, do you believe God unchangeably determined every single thing that would occur?
From a certain perspective, yes. The question is, so I would say, I can't say for certain that he did it for every single movement of every single molecule, but it's very possible that he knew exactly how to, arrange everything. The way you were saying earlier in the show, he knew exactly how to arrange everything so every decision would be made exactly as he wanted to be made. And at the end of the day, I don't see a difference between that, morally speaking, between that and predestination for Calvinism or concordance theology.
Okay. Well, in you saying that you're not sure it would apply to every movement of every molecule, you would differ from Calvinists in that respect. But so
yeah, and I'm not saying he doesn't either.
Yeah, but so you do not take such a. Yeah. So you don't. You're not as anti-free will as I've heard others in your camp, like Zender and them. I mean, they just despise almost the term. So you're a little different in that regard.
Yeah, I believe very similarly to them in that regard, but I prefer not to use the word free will as much as possible because I think it clouds the issue. I prefer to talk about, choice itself and selections and what God actually does predetermine and elect versus what he doesn't. As soon as you bring the word free will in, I think that just confuses the whole matter.
I got you. All right, well, I tell you what, I appreciate you calling in and giving the feedback.
Yeah, no problem. Good chatting with you again.
Good talking to you. All right, well, some interesting things there. So, but you heard the ultimate point I was making as I started, that Drew will have no problem saying, yes, God is the author of sin. Now, I think that's a very bad conclusion to come to, but my point is, he doesn't try to do what those like Jeremiah and others try to do by trying to get out of the ultimate conclusion that he is. See, they you heard in the debate, and that was one of the worst parts for Jeremiah, and he brought it upon himself, actually, but in the cross-examination, he used the analogy of God as an author of a book, that the author of a book, I might just play it. There he is right there. He's in the chat. Did you know I was talking about you? Because I was just talking about you. How about that? What a coincidence. But I think this is one of the toughest parts for him, which was him bringing up the author of the book. And that's kind of the feedback I heard on that too, that, man, he just lost it there. And by the way, Jeremiah, I'm open to discussion with you here, but as it tends to be, I will probably let you say what you want to say in the side chat without having the second debate here. But I'm willing to discuss though as well too. You can still call in. I'm just saying, unless you say, hey, I want to address this. Hey, I want to ask you this. I'm just going to, talk in general, and you can kind of say what you want to in there. And I say that because Jeremiah and I have future plans to just discuss these things as well. So we're not just, leaving it at that debate. But to say that he was the author of, that the author of a book is not responsible for the things he writes, and say that God is the author. Well, I said, if God is the author of his book, which is life, isn't he the author of sin? And I think, Drew, I would agree with everything except for definitely sin. Oh, and by the way, Truth for Proof was asking, I don't remember because some people were coming in and out as it went on. There was a good number there. Jeremiah might have a better idea. Truth with Proof is asking how many people were in the audience. It definitely wasn't 100. It was anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50, somewhere in there. Maybe 30, 40. But let's play some more.
I believe libertarian.
I said, though, this really is a debate about, obviously we could say, well, what the Bible says, that goes without saying. We both are going to argue from Scripture. But
oh, yeah, that's what I was saying. Now, Drew, that's right. The only difference I would disagree with you on is to say definitely. See, that's the difference with me and Calvinists. God has to determine everything down to the intentions and motives of man to get man to the end result, whether it's the atonement or whatever. I believe he doesn't have to do that. I think he does not have to determine the moves on both sides of the chessboard. And he doesn't just foresee and then use it. He actually can arrange the very people who are wicked and use their wickedness. So I think he can orchestrate, and I love the word orchestrate, or set people up to do exactly what he planned and purposed, using them as they are. So, okay, so David Lewis says John Piper did write a 700-page book on this topic called Providence. Yeah, okay, so at least when what I saw, he said the thing is a mystery. So if he does try to explain it, okay, so then he would be doing what the rest of them do as well. But I did hear him say it was a mystery too, which simply means something you can't understand. But MacArthur made no bones about it. He said, I can't explain this. Don't ask me to do it. It's not my job. My peon brain cannot do that. Okay, let's listen to Jeremiah here.
summary, I will say that I believe
Moral agency is mutually exclusive with divine determinism. Me and him are on the same page. Libertarian free.
All right, so now we heard that a little bit. So let's go to the next part. All right, let's go to his rebuttal. This will be his first rebuttal. He had a presentation, a rebuttal.
From the negative, Jeremiah has 15 minutes for his rebuttal.
Now, I believe Matt Slick has said, basically, yes, it's God's fault.
All right. I got 15 minutes. Let's see what we can do. What I heard over and over and over again is, Jeremiah, it's irrational for me to make a choice, a decision, an intention if God determined it. Well, of course, that's irrational if you assume.
Okay, now, Jeremiah, since you're here, now realize it's not just me because of my assumptions. You have, like Drew Costin here, who's got very similar views to you, but he's got no problem saying God authors sin. So it's not just a person who holds my premises. There's plenty of people that hold your premise. Now, you may say, well, I disagree. Fine, but simply presenting it as a problem of my assumptions that's not really the case. When lots of people who hold the premises of determinism, and even Drew says that there is something he would call free will, but he's got no problem being, I believe, consistent in saying God is the author of sin, therefore. Yes, it will continue.
Incompatibilism. I have not heard one argument in favor of incompatibilism. I've heard him beg the question in favor of
Well, I did appeal to a variety of scriptures to show that they don't mean what they say. The idea, Jeremiah did this, we went back and forth on Jeremiah 19:5, where it says, the sacrifice of their children was not something that originated in God's heart. Jeremiah's response was to continually say, well, I believe that this expresses his true heart's desire. Well, it may express it, but it's not all that it is communicating. It doesn't just say it expresses it. It did not enter. And you have to think behind what is being said, because a lot of this came down to this. He would say, well, that's just from human perspective, it's just anthropomorphic. So let's take God reacting. It's Jeremiah's position that God does not react. God does not react. I show from the Bible, or I said the Bible has him reacting all the time, like he's being displeased with our sin. Jeremiah's position basically is, well, this is anthropomorphic. It's a human perspective. The issue is, I have no problem with figurative language and anthropomorphic language, but it has to communicate true things. It can't communicate that which is false. Let me give an example. When it talks about God's eyes being in every place, now it is anthropomorphic. He doesn't literally have eyes. Yes, the use of the figurative language, of anthropomorphic language, is to attribute human attributes to God so that we can understand and talk about him. So yes, it's not literal. He doesn't literally have eyes, but it still communicates a truth. He does see in some sense of that word. But if God doesn't see at all in reality, then the language is communicating a falsehood. So to say that God is displeased in the Bible, which it continually does with sin, and to say, well, that's anthropomorphic, it's the human perspective. But if he actually does not react in reality, then it's communicating something from the human perspective that is false. It can't communicate the opposite of reality. So it's like, I forget, I asked somebody that once, it was similar to this, where they said, well, that's just figurative language. I said, okay, so then what is it communicating? And he struggled, because if it doesn't communicate to some extent a reaction in this example, then what is it communicating? David says, but okay, would you say God has nothing whatsoever to do with evil entering his creation, even in the sense that he knew it would occur before he created anyway? No, I wouldn't say that at all. But as we understand, evil is not a thing that he created. God did not create evil. He created freedom. I think that answers the problem. You see, when God creates a creature that has freedom to act contrary to what is good or God's character, that's what is called evil. The reason that's on the person is because they don't have to do it. Humans bring other children. We bring our children into existence knowing that those children will potentially do something wrong to somebody at some time. But we're not morally liable because unless the child itself is not morally liable, like he's 2 years old, and we let him go and, smother their sibling, as unfortunately happens, then the parents are liable at that point to some degree because the child's not himself. But when the children become liable, and I keep saying liable, accountable, liable. What liable? That's not the word I'm looking for. When the child itself is accountable for himself, you don't hold the parents responsible any longer. Except you could say that they did not raise him right, which is not true with God, of course, in those respects. But yes, it is true. If God didn't create anybody, there would be no evil. That's certainly true. But that he's not blameworthy for people who do evil when they don't have to, especially when he offers forgiveness and mercy and direction. So that's the difference. The problem is in Calvinism, he just necessitates it. And it does originate in his heart. Jeremiah 19:5 says, the sacrifice of children didn't enter into his heart. Not just wasn't an expression of his heart, which is an implication, but in Calvinism, it originates in his heart. That cannot be communicated by Jeremiah 19:5. So you are right, David. He does have something to do with it, because if he didn't create, it wouldn't exist. But it's out of freedom that creatures are choosing. It's kind of like saying, if God did not, what analogy would you use? Imagine God creates a room that is just full of lights, so many lights in so many directions, and he creates it this way from the beginning that there's no shadows and no darkness in any respect. But he also puts a light switch in the room, and he creates a free agent on the outside. And so the free agent then is told, you could turn the switch off and create darkness and shadow and whatever, or you cannot, and you shouldn't. you should leave the light on. Well, because he's created the man with freedom and isn't determining whether he will or not switch the light on or off, let's say the man chooses to switch it off, and thus darkness has now existed for the first time. Well, in a sense, yes, God is responsible, because if he didn't create the room and he didn't create the man, there would be no darkness at all. But we could see even in the illustration that it's really the man who's responsible and is blameworthy and can be justly punished for doing it. But did God know they would abuse that freedom? Yes. If yes, then in some sense you agree that God chose to create a universe with evil in it. Absolutely, I agree with you. Only open theists are consistent on these issues. I'm consistent. I agreed with you. But he has the right to create people and give them freedom. And if they do evil, they get punished because they don't have to do it. All the while, God has shown lots of mercy to all these people. Even so. So, and I don't think open theists are consistent, because they also recognize that even knowing he would create freedom, he would know that there would be evil. All right. We shall listen to more Nortier.
Compatibilism, but that's not an argument. And so I do want to address a number of things that he says, the verses, but all of my arguments, all 5 arguments, he did exactly what I thought he would do. So I want to go through that, but Jonah comes to mind first. So what's the purpose of God determining?
Now, concerning Jeremiah 19:5, Drew says, truth with proof. No, I've had one in-person debate. It wasn't published on the internet or at all, but it was in public. But Drew had said, I'd say it didn't originate in his heart, but in his intention. I often have intentions that are contrary to my heart, but they're in your heart, is the point. So you wouldn't say that originated. Well, it does originate because it flows from his heart. Remember that in Calvinism, at least, the reason it happens in time and in history is because of what originally was planned out and determined, which occurs in God's mind, which is his heart, which is also where his intentions are. So that's the point.
Jonah to be mad and be resistive and to go all the way into the belly of a well for 3 days and get spit up back on land? Well, I'll tell you, God's intention for all of it, it was to reflect the gospel, was it not? Matthew 12 says you have been given a sign of...
You heard what he said. I want to respond to that. Now, I had mentioned Jonah, and I said, here's an example where God doesn't need to determine somebody's will in order to get them to do what he wills for them to do. Jonah ran. God got him there anyway. And he still wasn't happy in the end, but he still did what God wanted him to do. See, God doesn't need to determine people's will in order to accomplish his own. He's wise enough and sovereign enough where he doesn't need to do it. He would actually be, it would take a wiser and stronger God to do that. And David, by the way, admitted that, yes, he can do it that way. He doesn't have to, in other words, determine her will, which means that he would still be sovereign. But... So Jeremiah's response to Jonah is, well, God had a purpose. Well, that's irrelevant. I mean, I believe God had a purpose. And even the fact that it prefigures the gospel, I believe that's part of the purpose. But that's irrelevant to my argument. My argument was not that it was purposeless. My argument was that it is an irrational thing to say that it unchangeably determined Jonah to disobey, to then punish him for what he determined him to do, only to have him determined to change his mind to do it in the first place. See, that's completely unnecessary if you drop the determinism and just realize that God can work out his purpose without determining the man's motives and intentions. So,
Jonah, we see God's purpose, do we not? It's to reflect the gospel, and Jesus confirms that. I will give you a sign. It's the sign of Jonah. So yes, down to every thought and detail of Jonah was predetermined. Now, if you...
And there's no argument for that, of course. I mean, at least not with Jonah. Of course, he's presenting arguments in general for determinism. But just to say God has a purpose for an event doesn't prove in any way that he determines every thought and motive. See, God knows how to work out a purpose with an event without determining everything. He knows how to get his own strategies accomplished in the game of chess without determining the moves on both sides of the chessboard.
That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense if you just assume incompatibilism.
No, see, it doesn't make sense by the very conclusions of it. All you got to do is state it to show their irrationality of it. See, it doesn't mean anything to just repeatedly say, well, it only doesn't make sense to AK because he assumes incompatibilism. No, I mean, you can state the fact as it is in your theology and let it show itself to be irrational. It doesn't matter what I assume. To say that God, and I gave many examples of this, to say that God permits is irrational. Well, he says, well, it's human perspective. Well, then it's false. If you're saying that in reality God isn't permitting anything, which is what he did, what he admitted, then to say that God is permitting, even from a human perspective, is simply a false human perspective. It's a human perspective that communicates something that just simply is not true. That's why I was questioning him on that. And by the way, I wasted my time on that. It was not the most important thing. I should have went on quicker. I did exactly what I said I shouldn't do. I got a problem with it. But I asked him in the cross-examination. In fact, let's just go there.
All right, well, welcome back. If y'all...
But now, is it true that what he's permitted...
Questions from the audience. This is question time between the two of them. So we will start with the affirmative. AK, you may begin your cross-X. You have 25 minutes.
All right, so I'm going to start my questions with some of the things that you kind of said at the end.
Okay.
And I'm going to do my best not to spend a whole lot of time on one question. I have a big problem with that. We'll see how it goes, though. All right, now, so you were talking about permitting. And you said, well, from a human perspective, it's okay to say that. And you said, well, that AK says, what is he permitting but what he decrees? Okay. So I agree with you that it is okay for us to say that. But now, is it true that what he's permitting is the very things that he himself caused?
I could have explained that better. I agree that it's okay to say that from my perspective. I'm fine with that because it works in my perspective.
Yeah,
So my question to him was, what is God permitting, if not the very things he decrees in his view?
Compatibilists would account for that is in the human experience, it's anthropomorphic. So from God's perspective, it's not a permission, it's a decree. From man's perspective, God is allowing that. Now, I think it's compatible. God also ordained it, but I don't assume incompatibilism.
Okay, now, notice what he's saying from God's perspective. Which one is reality? Which perspective is true to the way things are in reality? Because if God unchangeably decrees everything, then he's not permitting anything because everything that happens is what he decided would happen. That's the way it works. Permit has no meaning in that case. If God decrees everything, then everything that happens is what it comes from him. He's not permitting himself. So that is irrational. That's just the reality of it. Now, Jeremiah kept saying it's irrational because I assume incompatibilism. No, it's irrational just because of the statement of it, that God's permitting his own decree. People don't permit themselves. But at some point in the questioning here, he will admit, yes, he is, the things he's permitting is what he decrees. That's why it's irrational. But based upon that, now all a person has to do is just think about it. Is it true to reality that God is permitting? To say that it's human perspective, okay, fine, but is it true to reality? No, it isn't. If Calvinism is true, to use words like permit or God restrains evil, they'll say that oftentimes. God is restraining evil people, and often is the case they say, Well, what is he restraining but the very things he decrees? See, you're using inconsistent words. You're taking words that are consistent with my worldview. You're taking from my position to use language. And that's irrational in your viewpoint. Now, spending time on that one particular question and the word permit was a waste of time. A little bit of time is okay. But you see, this is the problem. He's got a way of explaining things by coming up with categories. And I believe that categories have to be divided properly, of course. But ultimately, they do this in fallacious ways. In other words, they just come up with different categories of everything so that they can just keep moving things around. I'm not ascribing something to their motives. I'm just saying it is ultimately what it turns out to be. So this is what you see. Well, and from the human perspective, it's permitting. So this provides a way to rationalize in Jeremiah's mind using the word permit. Yes, it's human perspective, so it's fully rational. But it isn't rational if you keep pushing the dominoes back, if you keep going to the ultimate problem. But the human perspective is not reality. The human perspective is using language that is not true to reality because God isn't actually permitting. He isn't actually restraining. So what good does the human perspective do except communicate something that is not true? Now notice that he called it God's perspective. You know, God's perspective is reality. It's not just like God's opinion versus human opinion. God's perspective is clarity in all ways. God is the only being in the universe whose perspective is flawless because he sees it from all sides. So in God's perspective is just another way to say reality, which is just another way to say truth. So human perspective, if it is using language that is not consistent with truth, well, that's what we call being false.
At the onset.
Right. Well, so normally the normal usage of permit is when you permit somebody else to do something that they themselves are wanting to do. But if God is determining the things himself, and you just said that he's permitting what he himself causes. So just taking away the anthropomorphic language, then really he's not permitting, really, right? He's not permitting at all.
So from the Calvinist.
So just notice the question. It actually isn't difficult. So he's not really permitting. He divided it between God's perspective and man's perspective. So let's just deal with reality. Is it true? Is he really permitting anything?
Compatibilist perspective, that is key. Anthropomorphic. And like you just said, typically permission means human-to-human interaction. Mm-hmm. So when God interacts with man, this is anthropomorphic. And we can truly say God is permitting this action.
You cannot truly say. That is just simply false. And I think anybody could really see the problem with it. To use language, whether you call it human perspective or not, fine, anthropomorphic language. But if it communicates something that is not true, is false. I don't know how more clear I can make it. I'm going to use the same example or a similar one. When we speak of God's hands doing something, he doesn't really have hands. This is anthropomorphic language. But it is communicating something that is consistent with reality, that God is able to move and do things as if he did have hands. But if God doesn't move or do anything, and I think the eyes is a better example. God is able to see in some respect, meaning he's aware. We see to take in knowledge of what is happening in reality by looking with our eyes, and we see. Well, God isn't looking and seeing with eyes visually, physically, but he sees in the sense that he is able to acknowledge and take in, or he's able to know, let's just say it like that. He does have knowledge of what is occurring in reality. That's the way I'll say it. If you're trying to be very literal, God doesn't have eyes, but he sees in the sense that he does what we do with our eyes. He is aware of what occurs in reality. And that's what the point of it is, to say God's eyes are everywhere, he's beholding the good and the bad. It means he knows. So it is acknowledging, it is communicating something true in a figurative way. But if God doesn't know at all what is occurring in reality, and thus not seeing at all, then the anthropomorphic language is false, and it communicates deceptively. So to say, in this case, permit, or when they say restrain, say it's what anthropomorphic. But if God is not permitting in reality, which he's not, if he's decreeing everything, then the anthropomorphic use of permitting is fallacious. It is false. And it's the same thing with reaction. His position that God doesn't react and says, well, being displeased in Scripture is anthropomorphic, well, it's still false if he doesn't actually do what the anthropomorphic language says that he does. Yes, he doesn't do it in a human way, but he does it in some way, is the point.
Well, right, but using figurative language. But if you don't use figurative language, then he's not really permitting.
See, my question is, okay, fine. So let's deal with reality. Forget about the human perspective. Let's deal with reality. That's what I'm trying to get to, and that's what I kept pressing. The whole cross-examination is me grilling him, getting him to stay with the ultimate truth of things, explaining it in these categorical ways and anthropomorphic language. All that's fine when you want to talk about those things. But the issues of the debate exist in the aspect of the truths, the ultimate truths. So let's not spend a lot of time on anthropomorphic language. Let's just say, is it true in reality? See, this is the point of my questioning.
Anthropomorphic from the compatibilists.
Well, I agree, but I'm saying if you don't use the figurative language, then he's not permitting.
Right. If you assume incompatibilism.
So that's confusing. You said right, but then he said if you assume incompatibilism.
Well, just assume in your view, I mean, if you take away the figurative language and let's speak literally, you wouldn't say that he permits. He's just causing.
So I agree with literal because I can permit my child to do something. But when God permits, this is a relationship of a different kind. So compatibilism would say both are compatible with one another. God can eternally decree in...
But he's not answering. See, that's the whole cross-examination. I mean, absolutely no disrespect to Jeremiah, but he's just not dealing with what I'm asking him. Just let's stop saying why the use of the language is, or what you call the use of the language. Why is it being used? The question is it true? And I don't mind explaining answers. I'm not one that typically just demands only a yes or no, but a yes or no in this case does work. It is either true or not, unless he just doesn't know. Now, when he was asking me about, in his cross-examination, about a man's ability to obey God's law perfectly, I was trying to say yes or no, but depending on what was meant and in what way. With, admittedly, what is a difficult question that the Bible doesn't just outright explain. Most people explain it with total depravity, a sin nature. Well, the Bible really doesn't explain it in those terms. Okay, and I was saying, okay, so man can obey God's law in its entirety in given moments. And that's what he's held accountable for. But what they seem to be talking is like, can you just perpetually live without disobeying or without sinning? No, I don't believe so. But it's the individual moments that you are held responsible for at any given time. I mean, you're looking at man's life as if he lives it on a span of time in one moment, but it's not true. So, admittedly, some things may be difficult. I don't think this is. It's just a logical question. If God decrees everything, if he unchangeably determines everything, is he permitting it? And the answer is no. So the use of permission is inconsistent with the ultimate truths. And permission wasn't the most important thing, but the actual argument of, is God reacting? Sure, God is reacting. It says that he does. Well, it's just saying in human ways. Well, that is agreed. I don't think God's reactions are like humans. I don't think it's based upon feelings in his mind called emotions. We ascribe emotions, but it is reaction. He does have emotion in some sense. Sure, it is not like human, but it is there. But to say he has no emotions and no reactions is just to say the opposite of what the Bible teaches.
Man can have a temporal experience.
Well, right, but if you don't use the... And so my position has always been, if you just say, yes, he doesn't really permit, we just say it figuratively, fine, I just want it to be kind of up front. So, literally speaking, he's not permitting anything because he caused the things.
I would disagree with the assumption of the question, because I would not univocate the will of the creature with the Creator. So I don't see a problem.
See, when I kept saying, okay, let's drop the figurative language and just use literal language, because this is his problem. He's avoiding the problem by simply citing the figurative language. And so the reason I'm saying, well, drop the figuratives, because once you say it in a literal way and you don't have that out anymore, then you have to say it as it is. No, he's not permitting. That's the point. Which means that in his view, the figurative use is just not true to reality, which would be the literal use. Because you can't say it literally, in his view, without it contradicting. Because you have to say figuratively he's permitting, literally he's not. That's the problem.
And like I said, I think
let's move ahead,
because
it's already 9, to the end of this where he talks about the author.
I find it difficult. I find this to be the problem.
On what man can do.
Okay, take any ability. Is there any power that man can utilize and actualize?
All right, let's listen to this a little bit.
And one necessitates man's choice. He chooses that he wants to do.
So let's
God has claimed that all you
speed
need
it up.
is if for moral accountability. If you desire to choose A, then you choose A. If you desire to choose B, then you choose B. That's conditional, not.
But it would be true that he's not permitting because he's causing. I mean, you don't permit the things that you cause.
I would say both are true. Both are compatible with one another.
Okay, so both are true, then yes, he's permitting what he's causing.
Yes.
Okay, so then I was true. When I
So
said
he's permitting what he's causing. That is irrational.
Not permitting, but the very things he causes, then you would say, yeah, AK was right.
And we would say, and there's no contradiction.
Okay, next question. Now, so you...
I'll try to say yes or no. I'm trying.
Hey, listen, that's all right. Let me ask this. Now, you kept saying, this has been a big thing with you, you keep saying that, well, AK assumes, when I say that what you're teaching is irrational, you say, well, AK is just saying it's irrational because he's assuming incompatibilism. Okay, so I want you to make it rational for me. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the Bible says that according to God's faithfulness, if you sin, you had a way not to sin if you do. Now, here's my question. If determinism is true, and that's your view, could you not have sin when you do sin?
We have a conditional ability. So I want to say there was an assumption that you're saying that do we have the category?
Okay, notice the question. The passage says, I was trying to bring up the Bible. It's slow when I got so many programs running for this program. Okay. Come on, catch up. If I already had it opened, it would be different, but now it's wanting to lag. So let's just get rid of that. Well, 1 Corinthians 10:13. You know the text. What Paul is saying about temptation. He's saying God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. We do have an ability. It's right there in the text. But with the temptation, make a way of escape so that you will be able to endure. Now, the point is obvious. That consistent with God's faithfulness to you, He will not allow you to be in a temptation or a test or a trial that you do not have an ability to endure. But that does not work in Calvinism. Because if you succumb to temptation and sin, it was because God unchangeably determined that you would, in which case you could not take the way out. So it doesn't mean anything. And that's what I'm questioning him on. There's some ability, according to Paul, to not sin when you sin. But that's not true. Because there is no ability to not sin if God unchangeably determines you to sin.
Ability to choose what we want to do. I'm saying no. You saw the if. You said it. If you choose to sin, or if you choose to not give in to temptation, there's a way and escape. That's conditional. I think that's all that's necessary for moral accountability, not this categorical ability that you're assuming is necessary for human responsibility.
Okay, so can a man choose the conditional choice of taking out this of escape? He can choose it when God determines that he...
Yes. The compatibilist sees no contradiction because conditional...
Now, notice my question was not quite finished, so that's a little bit confusing on exactly what he thinks he's answering. My question was, with the conditional ability, can you choose other than what God chooses for you to do, what he determines for you to do? So if you sin, and he's determined for you to sin, with this conditional ability that Jeremiah talks about, can you choose not to sin? Now, he said yes, but he did it a little bit before I got the words out about if God determined for you to do. Because the truth is, if that were true, then it isn't unchangeable.
He has the ability to fall into temptation if he lets that happen, if he deliberates and chooses sin, or if he does.
If he deliberates. Okay, but remember that God determines his deliberation. This is the point. Calvinists sometimes get tired, I think, when we keep saying, but God determined it. But that's because that is the most important element of everything they say. That's why nothing they say can be rationalized when that truth is brought into the conversation. They'll say, well, you're just refusing to believe the truth, okay? And I say, well, God determined for me to refuse to believe. They say, why? They get tired that you keep saying that. But that's only because it's not easy to deal with it when that is said. Because saying it, all you got to do is say it, and it's problematic. Because that's why he says, if he just says, as he did, well, man deliberates. Well, actually, deliberate requires thoughts going back and forth in your head and consideration and judgment. But God has determined all those things. So you don't get anywhere. That's the point. That's the problem. And with all respect to my Calvinist friends, this is your problem. And I do not believe it's the same as the Trinity. Yes, there are difficult concepts with the Trinity, but there's no blatant irrationality like this. The text means what it says. And it's not just, well, we always say that. Well, that's true, but the reality is it says you have an ability to endure temptation. So anytime you sin, you have the ability not to, but that can't be true if God determined for you to sin.
Desires not to and chooses to love Jesus more than that sin, then he can choose that. It's a different...
He can choose that. So then that would make God's decree will make it changeable. You see how it doesn't work? This is why it's such a cloudy thing when he's answering these things. Because anybody could hear that statement knowing their theology and say, well, that means it's changeable if he can do it.
Between conditional ability versus categorical ability.
Well, just any ability. I mean, the only ability we exercise when we choose to sin, that same ability, which is the one it's talking about. The same ability you use to sin, can you use that same ability to do other than what God determined?
That's categorical ability, not conditional ability.
Well, I'm talking about the same ability that you choose to sin. Can you use that, because that's the ability, it's only talking about one ability. Can you use that same ability to do other than what God decreed that you would do?
No, that's the assumption of incompatibilism.
See, there is a simplicity to it. The text says man has an ability to not sin. When he has sinned, he had the ability to not do it. So there's some ability. And so what I'm trying to get him to deal with is the ultimate conclusion that if he has an ability, then the sin that he commits when he does sin cannot be unchangeably determined. It doesn't work. You can't say that what God determines is unchangeable, if it's everything, if he determines everything and it's unchangeable, you can't say then man has the ability to change it. No, he doesn't. Man cannot change what is unchangeable by God. The creature cannot change what God determines to be unchangeable.
Well, just the text says that you will be able to endure it. Do you believe that you have the ability to endure it?
Conditionally, yes.
Okay.
Conditionally, yes. So you have the ability, conditionally, yes. So this is the cloud. He says conditionally, you have the ability. So when a person sins, they had the ability to not sin. So here in a second, when I ask him, is there any ability, you're going to see the back and forth. Because at some point he says no, but now he's saying, yes, you have this conditional ability. But see, this sounds reasonable when I say, well, so there is an ability to not sin if you do sin. Well, that means that you sinning is not unchangeable. If it is unchangeable, which is what they say it is, then you can't. There is no ability. Unless you, so the ultimate thing you have to say is God, man, creature, has the ability to do the exact opposite of what they're always saying. He has the ability to overpower God's unchangeable decree.
Well, a man can do other than what he
Not
was
categorically.
determined. Well,
Not
is there any
ultimately.
human power at all? I mean, you keep distinguishing abilities. Ultimately, the only ability that matters is the one that you could exercise to be judged by. The ability, let me ask this. The ability that you use for which those choices will cause you judgment and to be guilty, can you exercise that ability to do other than what God determined that you would do?
No, man does not have categorical ability. He has conditional ability, and the compatibilist sees no contradiction.
Well, you say that, but that's the part I find irrational.
Well, I understand.
So, but, I mean, I'm asking, so the category, explain to me in simple words what you mean by a categorical ability.
Do you mean contrast it with conditional
Well,
ability?
just give me a simple definition. Like it's the ability to do X.
All things being equal, inside and outside of your choice, with reasons and influences, I have the ability to choose A or not A. Now, conditional ability says I want to.
That's inconsistent. If you have, well, at least he's just explaining it at this
choose
point.
A
but-
because of reasons, because I want to. But if, the if is key. The difference between categorical and conditional is all and if. And the compatibilist is making the more modest claim that all you need is if for moral accountability.
Okay, man, he's talking about moral accountability there, which I hadn't brought up. I'm not asking about moral accountability. But he says we make the more modest claim of conditional ability, which is that it's the if. Well, the reality is either man has some ability to do other than what God decreed, and if he does, it isn't unchangeable.
If you desire to choose A, then you choose A. If you desire to choose B, then you choose B. That's conditional, not.
See, listen to the statement. Now, I almost want to just write that down because I'm going to show you. It just, what intuitively doesn't work about that statement in their theology. Well, now, let's see if it works. So he says, if you desire to do A, you'll choose A. If you desire to do B, something along those lines, you'll do B. But what's the problem? What's that question we always said? Ask. Ask. Ask question. What question is it? Yeah. Now, running all this stuff, I guess it's hard to open. Sometimes it works, though. If not, okay, we got it here. All right, so let's listen to what he says again, and I want to write it down. And I said I was going to address something that another guy that he meets with, Adam Carmichael, brought up in the side chat of the debate when I put it on my channel. Nice guy, by the way. But he brought up David being incited by God to census Israel. I'm not going to have time for that for now. But so... All right, let's make this smaller. We're going to bring this up. Okay. Now, what does he say?
That same ability. which is the one it's talking about. The same ability you use to sin, can you use that same ability to do other than what God determined?
That's categorical ability, not conditional ability.
Well, I'm talking about the same ability that you choose to sin. Can you use that, because that's the ability, it's only talking about one ability. Can you use that same ability to do other than what God decreed that you would do?
No, that's the assumption of incompatibilism.
Well, just the text says that you will be able to endure it. Do you believe that you have the ability to endure it?
Conditionally, yes.
Okay, so a man can do other than what he
Not
was
categorically.
determined. Well,
Not
is there any
ultimately.
human power at all? I mean, you keep distinguishing abilities. Ultimately, the only ability that matters is the one that you could exercise to be judged by. The ability, let me ask this. The ability that you use for which those choices will cause you judgment and to be guilty, can you exercise that ability to do other than what God determined that you would do?
No, man does not have categorical ability. He has conditional ability, and the compatibilist sees no contradiction.
Well, you say that, but that's the part I find irrational.
Well, I understand.
So, but, I mean, I'm asking, so the category, explain to me in simple words what you mean by a categorical ability.
You mean contrast it with conditional
Well,
ability?
just give me a simple definition. Like it's the ability to do X.
All things being equal, inside and outside of your choice, with reasons and influences, I have the ability to choose A or not A. Now, conditional ability says I want to choose A because of reasons, because I want to, but the if is key. The difference between categorical and conditional is all and if. And the compatibilist is making the more modest claim that all you need is if for moral accountability. If you desire to choose A, then you choose A. If you desire to choose B, then you choose B. That's conditional, not...
All right. If you desire to choose A, you choose A. If you desire to choose B, you choose B. He said that's conditional. That's conditional. It's hard to talk and write for me. Ability. Okay. That's conditional ability. Now, earlier he said conditionally you have the ability to do other than what you were determined to do. But who chooses your desire? So if conditional ability, you have the desire to choose A, so you choose A, but if you have the desire to choose B, you choose B. But if your desires, so here's the problem. Right here. What's the question? What's the question? So I want you guys to ask it too, because so once again, he conceded, or he said that with conditional ability, you can choose. You do have an ability to choose other than what God determined. It's conditional ability. But what is conditional ability? Well, if you desire to choose A, you choose A. If you desire to choose B, you choose B. What's the problem? What's the question you always ask to get it to the problem? They'll put you one step out from the problem. How do you get one step to the problem? What's the question? If someone says, if you desire to choose A, you choose A. If you desire to choose B, you choose B. That's conditional ability. And if it's a Calvinist, what's the question you ask? Or at least point out. Who determines your desires? But God is determining your desires, so he's ultimately choosing your conditional ability. So if he chooses your desire, which results in your conditional ability's choice, then you got no control with conditional ability. It is utterly irrational. Because think about it. I mean, he's the one saying, I'm a person who repeats myself a lot because I sometimes think, well, they're not following me. Do you follow what I'm saying? He said, when I asked, as it says in the passage in 1 Corinthians 10:13, that there is an ability man has to do other than, or to not sin. Therefore, if God determines for you to sin, is there an ability, I asked, to not sin if God determines for you to sin? He said, yes, that's conditional ability. He said it earlier. What is conditional ability? This ability that we have to do other than what God determines. If you choose A, you choose A. If you choose B, well, if you desire to choose A, you choose A. If you desire to choose B, you choose B. But if God determines your desire, then he's also determining your choice of conditional ability. And if he determines your conditional ability's choice, then you're still going to sin if you sin. You don't have an ability. If your conditional ability is determined, and everything is determined in Calvinism, then you can't possibly do other than what he determines for you to do, no matter what ability, because all abilities are determined by God. The result of any ability is determined. You can't even utilize an ability. Like, I have the ability to play a guitar. That's an ability. But I can't choose to play the guitar if God determines for me to not have the desire. You see how this works? Conditional ability. If I desire to play the guitar, I'll play the guitar. If I desire to not play the guitar, I won't play the guitar. It's my conditional ability. But if God determines my desires, and they result in the choice to play or not to play, then I'm only going to do, and I can't really do, other than what God determined for me to do. And trying to get somebody to stay on the ultimate truth like that, like he even said, well, this is all that is needed for moral accountability. Well, that's cloudy too at that point, because I'm not even arguing about it. I mean, that's what it ultimately leads to, but that's not what my question entails at the moment.
Categorical.
Okay, so you're saying a man has a conditional ability to choose not to sin if in a situation where he sinned.
Yes.
But if God determined that he...
You heard it. Once again, man has the conditional ability to not sin if he did sin. He said yes. But if God determined for you to sin and your desire to sin, so you do have the ability to not do what God determined that you would do. No, because he doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe we could do differently than what God unchangeably decrees for us to do. And anyway, as we just explained to you, you're not going to use the ability. And if you can't use the ability, then it's the same as not having the ability.
Sin, can he utilize the conditional ability to then choose other than what God determined?
That's not the
Okay,
definition.
it's almost 9:30.
Well, what I'm asking is...
I'm going to go to the author argument.
ability to utilize and actualize that will make his choice different than what God determined for him to do.
In there.
No, that's fine. Okay, so now in the Jeremiah passage...
The definition of divine determinism.
Okay, so then man is being held responsible for what God controls.
Yes. That's
okay.
compatibilism.
Okay, can you name any other aspect of life where you will hold somebody else responsible for what they cannot
Or
control?
you mean when I interact with man and what that looks like and then press that on my relationship with God? No, I don't.
You mean like when the Bible gives analogies all the time that compares God to man-like things or even towers and inanimate objects? See, to avoid the answer to a question by saying, well, that's just projecting human things onto God, well, the Bible does that. It's fine. God is comparable to humans in some respects. Absolutely. Otherwise, anthropomorphic language wouldn't even work. God is comparable to humans to some extent in a variety of ways. Otherwise, the Bible wouldn't do it. So that's just a way to avoid the question. I say, oh, you mean take something human and project it onto God? No, just answer the question. That's really all that is needed.
One to one the same. I think it's analogous.
Well, no, I'm just asking, is there any other aspect of human...
I will tell you this.
See, okay, now this is actually very important. Everybody stop what you're doing because this is, I find, super important. A point to realize. What he's doing here is saying, because I asked him, he claims that it is rational for God to hold men accountable if he determines all things, unchangeably so. That's what he's been arguing this whole time, that it is rational to the compatibilist. I asked, name any other aspect of life where you can rationalize that kind of thing. Holding somebody morally responsible for something they have absolutely no control over. And what did he say? Oh, you mean take something human-like and project it onto God like it's a one-in-one comparison. You can't do that. So basically he's saying just, well, God is too different. You can't do that. You can't compare it to any other aspect of life. That's special pleading. Now, it is true that God is not comparable in all respects. Everybody admits that. But saying that something irrational in every aspect of human life, especially when it comes to moral accountability and moral judgments and things like that, and saying you can't make a comparison like that because God is God. If that were the case, you could say absolutely anything about God that would be reprehensible and just say, oh, well, it's different. The Bible says God cannot lie. Well, why can't we just say, well, God can lie, and then we say, well, if lying is wrong, it's bad. No, God is God. He's different than humans. You can make God do anything and say anything about him that would be morally reprehensible within humans, and then justify it by saying, well, but he's God. You just can't make the comparison. So God, how about saying that, well, I'm a little bit hesitant to even make a comparison, but I need to make one that's quite obvious. Could God, let's just say, could God just with his supernatural power force a baby to go through, something horrible, go through a meat grinder over and over without dying? And would that be morally just? Just to take a baby and to, with his power, keep the baby from dying, but have the baby keep going through a meat grinder over and over and over and over. See, now that's hard to talk about. And the reason it would be hard to talk about, because that would be morally reprehensible. But this idea of what he's doing here, now not that, see, this is but it would be inconsistent. Jeremiah, of course, would not ever say God would do something like that, because he knows it would be morally reprehensible. But that would be inconsistent. I'm glad he is inconsistent. But it would, if I were to say that, and someone said, you're saying God would do something like that, and say, oh, well, why not? You say, because that would be evil, it would be wicked. And then I could just say, you're projecting something about humans onto God. You can't make a comparison like that. God is God. It's different. You can't, it doesn't work that way. You see, morality, the reason we understand morality is because it's a reflection of God's character. So it is relatable. You can compare human morality to God. And you can say that he is held to the same measure because the measure is him. He is the measure. That's the point. The reason God would not do something like that or be unfaithful, God would not be unfaithful because his character is faithful. But you know what? God is also rational. But the idea of holding somebody accountable and judging them with a pretty intense judgment for something they have absolutely no control is morally unjust. But to say, well, he's God, though, you can't make that comparison. No, you can, because that's where morality comes from. Morality is grounded in God. The morality that humans perceive or that we practice, and such as this, holding somebody accountable for what they cannot control, is something we can hold God to, because in a way, I mean, we're not holding him to it, but we can ask these questions, and we can ask the questions like I did, because that's where morality comes from. This kind of morality in other aspects of life, the reason it is a part of life in the first place is because it comes from God. Morality is a reflection of his character. That's what it's grounded in. It's not just a list of rules that can be changed. You can be faithful to your wife. You should be, only because he said to do. But if he hadn't said be faithful, you wouldn't really have to be faithful to your wife, and it wouldn't be bad if he didn't say not to do it. No, the reason it's bad to be unfaithful to your spouse or in any other aspect is because faithfulness is rooted in God's character. You can't just say, the Bible talks about him being faithful. But if the Bible ever never actually said the statement that he was faithful, I suppose hypothetically somebody can come along and say, well, he's unfaithful. Well, no, it's wrong to be unfaithful. And they say, no, he's God. You can't make that comparison. We can't take human faithfulness and relate it to God, but it would not be true. You can. In this case, it does say he's faithful right out, so nobody makes that argument.
Because whatever...
There is one example.
Okay.
That I think is good, but there's continuity in this way. There is continuity and discontinuity where they wrote, but it's not wrong.
Oh, I skipped it, but this is the author stuff.
Okay, so then man is being held responsible for what God controls.
Yes. That's
okay.
compatibilism.
Okay, can you name any other aspect of life where you will hold somebody else responsible for what they cannot
Oh,
control?
you mean when I interact with man and what that looks like and then press that on my relationship with God? No, I don't think that is one-to-one the same. I think it's analogous.
Well, no, I'm just asking, is there any other aspect of human...
I will tell you this. There is one example.
Okay.
That I think is good, but there's continuity and discontinuity.
All right.
I think a person can write a story and be morally free to do so with murder, evil, gross things, and they are ultimately responsible for the story they wrote, but it's not wrong for them to do that. They can use secondary means like in Harry Potter, of all the evil. I don't want to give spoilers, but when Voldemort killed Harry Potter's parents, he was wrong for doing that, but the human writer also is responsible for that in a different way.
But the author of the book is the author of everything that happens?
Yes.
So sin happens in God's book. Is he the author of it?
He's not the effectual author of it.
Is he the author?
In what sense are you using the word
Same author as the way you use the analogy. I'm asking you, is he the author of what happens in the book, like your analogy?
So I would say in this way, there is continuity and discontinuity. The person that writes the book is the author of the book, and God, and I would just quote Isaiah here in a little bit, but he declares the end all the way from the beginning. I bet we'll talk a little bit about the middle there, but yes, there's continuity.
Okay, but
God,
if I can,
my bad.
Is he the author of what happens in his book?
Yes.
So when we say he's the author of sin and you guys disagree, you would say stop disagreeing?
No, I would just say we need to talk about what we mean by author.
Well, I mean, it's your analogy, though. I mean,
Right, there's continuity and discontinuity.
What does that mean he's the author?
Yes, God is the author of his creation.
Which means he's the author of sin.
This is very obvious, right?
Not the effectual author.
God is the author. God, see, that's the point. That's the dilemma that they face. It is his analogy. If a person authors a book, they have 100% control over everything that happens in the book, every choice their characters make, every word that comes out of their mouth, every evil deed done in their book, they author. It originates in their heart, and it must happen that way because the story is what they write it. Now, the reason, because he asked, well, is an author of a book morally accountable for those evils in his book? No, because it's not real. But that's the issue. He just conceded that God is the author of evil because God has just as much control in the real world that he creates over every aspect as an author does in the fake world of his book. And if the author is the author of the book and everything originates with him, that's the way it is with God, except in reality, in God's book, he makes the characters real and then punishes them for what he wrote, for the words that he puts in their mouth. You know, men are held accountable for the words, Jesus said. So when you are punished for the bad things you say, like about God, you speak evil against God, well, but he put the words in your mouth. Now, he does it through a means, they'll say, well, sure, but he has those means are just as much a part of his determination as anything else. The author of a book has a means too. It's its pen. Now, so the author of a book is the one who puts the words into his characters' mouths. But in reality, with God, it would be doing exactly the same thing, except he actualizes the characters and makes them real and then punishes them for the words he writes in their mouth. Do you understand? I think that's as clear as day to anybody. That would be like Shakespeare taking character out of his book, making it a real living, breathing person who exists and feels and has emotions, but is acting and thinking and speaking exactly the way he wrote them, and then he gets mad and punishes the person for what he wrote about the person. So, yes, Calvinism is irrational. Now, I will have a Calvinism series, and it will be more to the point than this. There will be more material played and more arguments made. Here, I took some phone calls. That was great, by the way. Haven't taken phone calls in a long time. I'm glad Drew called in, David for calling in. But I will planned to do a Calvinism series where I'm really going to try to address a lot of these things. And by the way, what I also planned, and I don't know how I'm going to do all of this, but I have a book by James White called The Potter's Freedom. I thought about reading through a lot of that and responding as we move along. So we'll figure it out. But we're going to have a lot of material here and respond to a lot of more arguments than we do in these live programs because of the interaction. I think these topics have to be addressed. But it is much, see here, and I'm going to say this, especially with our Calvinist friends. Now, I appreciate David so much for the debate we did. This thing that Jeremiah does here, and I'm not saying he's trying to do it on purpose or anything, but is much more difficult to do when you're debating a passage rather than a topic or concept. For example, what I would have done in just a exegetical debate like I did with David is said, just show me where determinism is in the text. And that's all it is. Their biggest weakness is exegesis. Because you can go to 1 Corinthians 10:13 and he could do all this stuff with this stuff that he was talking about, even though I think it's still, I think he well exposed the problem. And I think people saw that. But nevertheless, even then it's much more harder to do when you just say, well, let's debate this. Where is the passage that teaches determinism? And I think exegesis is really where they have the biggest problem. Now, they don't think that, obviously. They do have passages that they go to, but when you learn to ask them, where in the passage is what you say happening? Someone brought up the vessel and clay analogy in Romans 9 in the questions, in the audience questions. Of course, they didn't have a lot of time to answer. What is it about the clay and pot analogy that teaches unconditional election? That's not there. God determining who's a vessel of honor and dishonor, we both agree he does that. But does he do it unconditional? And they say, well, Jacob and Esau, that election was unconditional. It says it. Oh, yeah, but he's using an example of an election that was unconditional, but it wasn't one of salvation. Oh, so it's not about salvation. Well, no, he's making a point about salvation by using an example that is about God's choice from the past. It wasn't an example of an election of salvation, but he is making a point about salvation. And the potter and clay analogy doesn't say anything about God unconditionally choosing who will be what vessel. There is a condition, belief. It says that through the whole book of Romans. So this is the way you deal with it when you just go to the passage and say, where's determinism taught? I don't think Romans 9 is difficult at all. Ephesians is not at all. Now, there are better passages, and that's why I was originally going to talk about the passage that Adam Carmichael brought up, and I never did get to it, but I will eventually. David being incited by God to number Israel. Now, it doesn't teach determinism as they teach it. But if anything did, that's one of the better passages. So it's a word I like responses like that. Now, see, if I was going to offer something from their side, it would be a passage like that. Good job, Adam Carmichael. That's a good passage to talk about. It gets much closer. Well, it offers a better opportunity for your theology than Romans 9 or Ephesians 1, a passage like that. Genesis 50:23, the brothers, no, there's no determinism there. Assyria and Isaiah 10, no, it isn't. I'm amazed at when they say these things. Well, you see right there in Isaiah 10, God is punishing Assyria for what he determined for them to do. No, he's not. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say what the Bible says in Isaiah 10 that he determines to use them to punish Israel, but he's not punishing them for what they're doing to Israel. He's punishing them for the motives of their heart, their arrogance. It doesn't say he determined that. That's exactly the thing you need for it to say to establish your theology. So they usually have a weakness here when you just are able to pinpoint their assumption from the text. And it is an assumption being brought to 1 Samuel, what is it? I forget now, where God is inciting David to number Israel. Lots of assumptions there, but it's a good passage to present. And so I'm glad he did that. And I wanted to get to it, but didn't make it here. Okay, now the Apologetic Dog says, I can send you a better book that outlined the position I was defending if you want. I think it's better than White's Potter's Freedom. Oh, better than White's. Oh, well, that's a statement. To say something, a defense of it is better than White's. I'm kind of impressed that you would say that. I mean, somewhat comical, but okay. Well, if you send me the book, I will do my best to read it. I probably can't do it in one sitting, as I deal with other issues, but I will certainly make it a plan to read it. And hopefully Jeremiah, he said we will have a discussion, and in a thing like this, it's, he can't respond to everything I say from the side chat, of course. But have a discussion on these things at some point. But now that everybody's reminded about it, go see the debate with David Lewis. So I've went real long here because we haven't done it in a while, and I wanted to say a lot of things. We had some good calls. Appreciate everybody that came in the side chat. And you guys supporting me. I get lots of encouragement, lots of, motivational comments from people. I get criticism too. That's motivational too, but that's all right. All right, guys, I'm out.
It's easy to get discouraged and think it's never going to work out.
Knowing that there is a God